to understand the kinds of changes that are needed within that particular organization than some so-called expert at the apex of the management pyramid relying on reports to work their way steadily up through the layers of management to his or her desk. I saw a report recently on a group of investors who style themselves as the Motley Fool and exist on the internet. They base their approach on the principle that the individual consumer who notices that a particular brand of coffee tastes good may be better able to judge the relative value of the stocks offered by coffee companies than an investment advisor on Wall Street. If that individual consumer is linked to others who can also notice in their sphere of experience whether or not there's a shortage in the store, or whether or not the pricing is competitive. And by linking through the internet 100,000 different small investors, this particular group claims and has been credited with a performance for their predictions about particular stocks that far outstrips the major established brokerage houses. Well, all of this may raise a question much like the one that Lily Tomlin asked last week when President Clinton signed the new landmark legislation reforming American telecommunications law. As I was interacting with her during the signing ceremony over the internet, her character, Ernestine the operator, asked me, "Well, Mr. Smarty Pants, if you know so much, how come you're not signing the bill?" And to rephrase it, in other words, if this is such a great metaphor, how come it hasn't taken hold? Here's one possible explanation. I've got it wrong. Perhaps the metaphor of distributed intelligence simply isn't as powerful as I believe it is. Here's another possibility. The increasing segmentation of society, in particular the segmentation of scientific disciplines. At their best, the scientific community and the university community embody the ideal of distributed intelligence. The great power of science derives in part from specialization into disciplines. But much of the power also comes from open criticism and communication across disciplines. Indeed, some of the most significant discoveries have emerged from the productive friction that occurs when different perspectives rub against each other and produce the spark of new insight. But if the physicists don't talk to the chemists, and the chemists don't talk to the economists, and the economists don't talk to the climatologists, then distributed intelligence is more aspiration than reality. Look at the resistance Lynn Margulies faced for her astonishing discoveries about the evolution of cells. Because the basic principles she explored crossed so many different disciplines, those critics who insisted upon evaluating her insights within the narrow confines of a single discipline held out long after they should have and resisted the insight that she was providing. If it is true within science, how much more of a problem is it at the boundary between science and the rest of society? There's a third possibility why the notion of distributed intelligence has not migrated into our public conversation, and that is the growing disconnect between science and democracy. Walk through the halls of Congress and you will see the Gucci loafers of corporate lobbyists, but not the white lab coats of American scientists. Page through a directory of members of Congress and you will find over 150 lawyers, but only 6 scientists, 2 engineers, and 1 science teacher among the 535 people in the House and Senate. As a result, scientific concepts sometimes are missing from our public discourse. And that is, in my view, unfortunate. But let me dwell a moment on some of the harder-edged consequences in the hopes that it will solidify my case for this new metaphor. Lack of scientific understanding undercuts support for the pursuit of further understanding, which fosters deeper ignorance, which in turn further erodes support for efforts to battle that ignorance. It's a vicious cycle, and it's well underway. Listen to what some members of Congress have been saying recently. 2 weeks after the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina, who are here in the front row, I didn't know you two were going to be here when I wrote this, but I'm glad you are. 2 weeks after the two of them were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their work on ozone depletion, the chairman of the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives, Texas Congressman Tom DeLay, said, and I'm quoting, "The science underlying the CFC ban is debatable and the result of a media scare." The same gentleman also said that we made a terrible mistake as a society to ban DDT because it is not harmful in his considered view. Another of his colleagues recently said that climate change is just, quote, liberal claptrap. And just a few weeks ago, there was a hearing on clean drinking water, looking at problems such as the cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee, which killed 100 people 2 years ago. An Oklahoma congressman said, and I'm quoting once again to assure you that I'm not making this up, "I want to touch on cryptosporidium for a minute. This disease can sometimes be very helpful because it helps us identify those who, in fact, are immune compromised." Well, when you think about it, there are all sorts of diagnostic tools that could be used. These comments ought to send shivers up our spines because they suggest that the lack of scientific language and metaphors is merely the symptom of a deeper disregard for science itself, a taste for junk science, a belief that science is just another rhetorical tool to be manipulated and twisted in order to fit a preconceived ideological view. It's further proof of the vicious cycle I mentioned a few moments ago, and that's precisely the opposite of how it should work in America. For much of this century, Americans have benefited from a virtuous cycle, a virtuous circle of science and success. As the nation generated wealth, a portion of that wealth was invested in research, science, and technology. Those investments helped answer what seemed answerable and eventually spawned still greater wealth, which was then invested in still more research. On and on it went. In this virtuous circle, launched with bipartisan agreement and support, prosperity generated investment, investment generated answers, and answers generated further prosperity. But now, because of the woeful lack of knowledge, some evidence of which I've just presented, that virtuous circle risks coming undone. At the very moment a new age demands continued investments in science and technology, there are some in Congress threatening to turn the clock backward with the largest cuts in 15 years. In their most recent budget, according to the AAAS's own study, the congressional leadership proposed reducing federal funding for science and technology by 1/3 by the year 2002, adjusted for inflation. And several years after the Cold War has ended, they propose that defense R&D go up while civilian R&D goes sharply down. More for Star Wars, less for environmental research. At the very moment global economic competition and global environmental degradation demand civilian research and the technologies it often produces, this Congress is proposing the sharpest cuts in non-defense research since America was in the midst of fighting World War II. On question after question, they say, we don't know enough to act, and we don't want to know. The latter statement being implicit in their sharp cuts in the research necessary to improve our understanding of the most serious challenges that we face. This organization's study a few months ago laid out the numbers plain and simple. The only investment that Congress wants to increase was in health sciences, and that's great, and it's understandable. All of us who have had family members stricken by a disease that has not yet yielded to the search for a cure understand why this ought to be increased. But in almost every other realm, they are approaching science with the wisdom of a potted plant. Research on issues and again, part of the reason is while it's easy for all of us to understand the need for more health research, it ought to be easier for all of us in public life to understand the urgency of the questions that are being pursued in other realms of science. Research on issues that will affect the health of our children, the condition of our planet, the vibrancy of our economy. All of these research tasks risk being slashed to the bone. Global climate change, down. Supercomputers, down. Nuclear nonproliferation, down. New materials, way down. Solar energy, way down. Environmental satellites, down. Water quality, down. Everything that ought to be up is down with this Congress, and everything that ought to be open is closed. Their science policy is straight out of science fiction. A few of them speak impressively like Johnny Mnemonic, but most support policies designed for Fred Flintstone. They propose to go boldly where no Congress has gone before, but their flight plan will take us into the ground. President Clinton vetoed several of the bills containing these cuts, but not before the other side shut down the government and furloughed thousands of government scientists. And right now, several agencies, in particular the National Science Foundation, are sputtering along with stopgap funding that makes it almost impossible to plan and difficult even to finance day-to-day activities. But the saddest part is that it doesn't have to be this way. Last week, President Clinton proposed a budget outline that leads to the first balanced budget in 17 years, and he gets there without compromising our values, without abandoning our commitments to education, the environment, and science and technology. Of course, we have got to balance the budget, but there is both a sensible path and a dangerous path that can take us there. President Clinton has offered a better way. On education, he's made real progress, launching direct student loans, opening the doors of college to more Americans, establishing education standards so every diploma will mean something, promoting educational technology in the classroom, proposing a plan to link every classroom and every library in America to the information superhighway by the year 2000, proposing a tax deduction for families' investments in higher education. And on science and technology, he has also scored big, in large part because he's fielded such a strong scientific team. Jack Gibbons has become the most influential science advisor the White House has seen in a generation. Cabinet secretaries like Bruce Babbitt, Ron Brown, Carol Browner, Hazel O'Leary, and Donna Shalala have fought for a cleaner environment, a strong technology base, national laboratories, and healthcare research. Dan Golden has helped take NASA to the stars while keeping the costs here on Earth. And every layer of the administration is peopled with women and men dedicated to discovery. And that team has delivered results. We've extended the R&D tax credit for 3 years, lowered capital gains taxes for investments in emerging companies, scaled back the antitrust barriers to joint ventures in research, beefed up protection of intellectual property, giving inventors real protections for their patents, boosted funding for the nation's flagship research agencies, launched an educational technology initiative, established the National Science and Technology Council, supported enhanced research into global environmental problems such as climate change, and ensured our environmental regulations meet the test of common sense and cutting-edge science. But we cannot do it alone, and that is not how democracies work. And that is where you come in. Democracies depend on distributed intelligence, and this democracy needs the sound of your voices and the dedication of your hearts. You must take up the call for knowledge. You must enlist in the army of persuasion, whose battle cry says that knowledge is important for knowledge's own sake. Because when you say something is important and say it with enough force, others just may pay attention. But if you view your own pursuit of knowledge as divorced from the nation's pursuit of progress, both endeavors will fall short of their goals. In a sense, at this edge of a new century, we have a choice between two paths. One retreats from understanding, flinches in the face of challenges, and disdains research and learning. It's a know-nothing society in which the storehouses of knowledge fall into disrepair, the spigots of discovery are twisted off, and missions of exploration are stalled on the ground. This know-nothing society would base regulations on suspicion instead of science. It says DDT isn't harmful, claims global warming is the empirical equivalent of the Easter Bunny, is a direct descendant of the society